Guys, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I hadn't been back to the desert in years, not since my uncle sold the diner on Route 86 and left for the coast. But when the news came, some government-sponsored job opening up near the old mining town of Halton, I figured I'd give it a shot, a fresh start. The offer wasn't glamorous, but it promised steady pay, free housing, and a chance to get away from my dead-end delivery gig in the city. Flights were out of my budget, so I took the van, an old rust bucket with peeling paint and a stereo that barely worked. The trip would take most of the night, but I didn't mind. Driving long stretches of empty highway had always been a kind of therapy for me. You could get lost out there. No buildings, no sirens, no one needing you for anything. As the city lights faded behind me, I slipped into that familiar rhythm. The hum of tires against cracked asphalt, the occasional distant flicker of headlights heading the other way. My thermos was full of bitter coffee, and for the first few hours, I was wide awake. The desert stretched out on both sides, flat and endless. But somewhere around mile marker 220, the emptiness started to get to me. The clock on the dashboard glared 1:43 a.m., and my eyelids grew heavy. I turned up the radio, but all I could catch was static. No music, no voices, just empty sound. Then I saw him, a figure standing by the road. It didn't make sense. No cars in sight, no nearby exits. Just a man standing completely still in the pale glow of the van's headlights. He wore a charcoal gray suit, formal, out of place here. His face was obscured by the shadows, but he stood like he was waiting for something. For me. As I passed him, a cold shiver ran down my spine. His head turned, following my van's movement with a slow, deliberate tilt. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. But my knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Maybe he needed help. That thought gnawed at me. What if he'd broken down? People went missing in the desert all the time. Maybe I should have turned back. I forced the idea out of my mind. The drive was getting to me. I just needed more coffee. But 10 miles later, I saw him again. Same man. Same suit. Same stillness. Impossible. I stomped on the brakes, pulling off onto the gravel shoulder. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked back through the rear window, searching the dark highway behind me. No one was there. I scanned the horizon. Just dust and distant ridges. The figure had vanished. I told myself I was hallucinating. Sleep deprivation. That's all. But the back of my neck prickled with unease. I found a rest stop a few miles later. A single gas station surrounded by dim floodlights buzzing with moths. I grabbed another coffee inside. As I sipped it, I looked through the window at the empty parking lot. And there he was, standing under a broken street lamp, his face fully visible this time. Middle-aged, pale skin, dark eyes, a blank expression that somehow felt knowing. He stared directly at me, motionless. I didn't finish the coffee. I got in the van and drove. I told myself I wouldn't stop again, but fatigue clawed at me. My vision blurred. The double yellow lines stretched endlessly, and I was afraid I'd drift off and crash. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt access road and parked beneath an old billboard half swallowed by sand. I locked the doors. Reclining my seat, I tried to close my eyes, but sleep didn't come. My mind replayed that face, those eyes, watching, waiting. Minutes or hours passed. The world outside was silent. But then a noise, a soft tap, echoed from behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, glancing at the rearview mirror. A face stared back. His face. In my back seat. I screamed. The door flew open as I tumbled out onto the hard dirt, scraping my hands and knees. I scrambled away from the van, heart hammering so loud it drowned out everything else. But when I finally gathered the courage to look inside, the back seat was empty. No sign of him. I stood there under the vast desert sky, gulping dry air, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Was it exhaustion? Stress? Had my mind conjured the figure I feared most? Maybe. But the next morning, everything took a turn I couldn't explain. I made it to Halton, barely functional but determined. The facility where the interview was being held was a sterile building of concrete and glass. I tried to shake off the night's fear, convincing myself it was just a trick of the mind. And then the hiring manager walked out to greet me. The man in the suit. Same face, same expression, as if the desert had followed me here. My breath caught in my throat. He extended a hand, polite but distant. I forced a smile, forced my body to move. The interview passed in a haze. My answers were shaky. My mind replayed the night's horrors, wondering if I was awake or still dreaming. I left convinced I'd blown it. But a week later, I got the call. They offered me the job. I accepted, though I still don't know why. Maybe I needed to prove something to myself. Maybe I was too tired to question it. I moved to Halton, started working at the facility. Life settled into routine. But sometimes, when I'm locking up late or driving those dark desert roads home, I get the same feeling I had that night. Like someone's watching. Like I'm still on that road. And sometimes, when I glance in my rearview mirror, I catch a glimpse of a familiar face. A man in a suit, waiting. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the occasional glow of a distant street lamp. I had taken the back roads through Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, to avoid highway traffic, and now I was alone in the dark, winding through endless trees. It was just past midnight, the perfect time for an uninterrupted drive, just the way I liked it. My usual podcast hummed through the speakers, keeping me company as I pushed forward. But then my dashboard chimed. A warning light blinked at me. Low fuel. I sighed and pulled up my GPS, looking for the nearest gas station. The app directed me to a station a few miles ahead, the only one for miles in this isolated stretch of road. When I pulled in, the place was nearly deserted. A small, generic-looking station, its flickering neon sign barely illuminating the lot. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up pickup truck at one of the pumps. The driver, a man in a worn-out baseball cap and an oversized jacket, watched me as I got out of my car. His gaze lingered a second too long, enough to make me uneasy. I ignored him and went inside, buying a coffee and paying for my gas in cash. By the time I came back out, the man was climbing into his truck. He pulled out of the lot slowly, his eyes briefly meeting mine again before he disappeared down the road. Shaking off the strange feeling, I filled my tank, got back into my car, and continued my drive. But barely a minute after leaving the station, I spotted something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the road, just past the tree line, sat that same pickup truck, completely shut off. No headlights, no running engine. It was as if he had parked there just to wait. I kept driving, glancing at my rearview mirror to see if he would follow. Nothing. The truck remained still, swallowed by the darkness. I turned my podcast back on, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But a few minutes later, another chime from my dashboard demanded my attention. This time, the warning was worse. One of my tires was dangerously low on pressure. I slowed down, and soon a wobbling sound echoed through the cabin. A flat tire. I pulled to the side of the road and stepped out, my breath clouding in the cold night air. The rear driver's side tire was completely flat. I hadn't hit anything. I would have felt it. A disturbing thought wormed its way into my mind. What if that guy from the gas station slashed it? I pulled out my phone, searching for my roadside assistance number when I heard it. The faint rumble of an engine behind me. I turned, expecting to see headlights cutting through the night, but the road was pitch black. The sound of the engine stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. My pulse pounded in my ears as I walked to my trunk and grabbed the emergency flashlight my dad had given me. Flicking it on, I pointed the beam down the road. The light caught something reflective. Headlights. There, about 200 feet away, parked on the side of the road, was the pickup truck. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I gasped and bolted into the woods, crouching behind a thick bush and gripping my phone with shaking hands. I dialed 911. As the call connected, I heard the truck's engine start again. This time, the headlights flicked on, bathing the road in an eerie glow. The vehicle crept forward, rolling up beside my stranded car before stopping. Then, a voice called out, "You need some help?" I held my breath. My heart slammed against my ribs. 911 answered, and I whispered my location into the phone, explaining that my tire had been slashed, and the man I suspected was right outside. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I barely heard her over the ringing in my ears. Then, I heard the truck door open and close. I pressed myself further into the shadows of the trees. The dispatcher asked if I could see if he was armed, but before I could respond, my call disconnected. A terrible silence followed. I waited, phone gripped tight in my hand, hoping she would call back. Then, the sound of another vehicle approached. Headlights swept over the road. A second truck slowed as it neared my stranded car, and a man's voice called out, speaking to the driver of the first pickup. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught bits of the conversation. The man from the gas station was making up some story. Something about how he had stopped to help a stranded driver, how he hadn't seen anyone. A chill ran down my spine. If I didn't do something, this man could disappear into the night, and no one would ever believe what had happened. I made a split-second decision. I ran from the trees, stumbling onto the road, and yelled, "Help! I don't know him!" Both men turned to me. I pointed at the driver of the first pickup, breathless and shaking. "He slashed my tire and followed me here." The second man's expression twisted into a look of disgust as he turned back toward the pickup driver. The man from the gas station took a step back. "I don't know what she's talking about," he said quickly, his voice steady, but his eyes darting. "I just stopped to help." But then he moved, hurriedly backing toward his truck. He jumped inside, threw it into reverse, and sped off down the road before anyone could stop him. The second driver stayed with me as I tried to catch my breath. Minutes later, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark road. The officer took my statement while the other driver confirmed my story. He promised to check the gas station security cameras to see if the suspect had tampered with my car. But in the end, I never heard back. Maybe the footage showed nothing. Maybe the cameras weren't even working. Or maybe some people just know how to disappear. Even now, I still think about how close I came to something far worse than a flat tire. And I'll never drive that road alone again. I had been driving for hours through a relentless snowstorm, the roads barely visible beneath the thick white blanket. My destination was Todd's place, but with the weather worsening, I decided it wasn't safe to continue. Spotting a small, isolated motel on the side of the road, I pulled in. It wasn't much to look at, but it would have to do for the night. The front desk clerk handed me a key without much conversation. The place felt eerie, but exhaustion pushed me to ignore my unease. After settling into my room, I realized I was starving. The motel didn't offer food, so I remembered passing a small diner a few miles back. Grabbing my coat, I headed out, barely noticing a car parked in the lot with someone sitting inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. The diner was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered at tables. I ordered some food and exchanged polite conversation with a man named Toby, who sat a few seats away at the counter. He seemed friendly enough, though something about his demeanor unsettled me. I chalked it up to nerves from the long day and tried to relax. After finishing my meal, I returned to the motel. As I walked toward my room, I noticed the same car still parked outside. The person inside was no longer there. I brushed off the creeping sense of dread and hurried inside. Once in my room, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. Everything seemed fine. Later that night, as I sat on the bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a faint noise coming from the bathroom. It was odd, because I hadn't been in there since I returned. I leaned forward and saw that the bathroom door was shut. Had I closed it earlier? I couldn't remember. A chill ran down my spine. Panicking, I texted Todd to tell him I heard something in the bathroom. The realization hit me like a wave. I had run to the front desk earlier without locking the door. Had someone slipped in while I was gone? Todd asked if the door locked automatically. I wasn't sure. My heart pounded as he urged me to check the lock, advising me to take the key with me. With shaky hands, I slipped on my shoes and approached the door. It had a standard twist lock that moved with the knob from inside or with a key from the outside. As I opened the door to check, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the fresh snow outside my room, was an extra set of footprints. They led directly from the car I had seen earlier to my door. The car was now empty. Terror surged through me. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut and sprinted to the front desk. Gasping for breath, I cried out to the clerk, telling him there was an intruder in my room. The front desk worker, a slight man who didn't look eager to confront anyone, told me to stay with him. He picked up the phone and made a call. I assumed he was dialing the police, but instead, he spoke in a language I didn't recognize. It didn't sound like a call for emergency help, more like he was speaking to a friend. I stood by the glass window, watching the snowy path to my room. Then, I froze. The door to my room creaked open. Stepping out, as casually as if he belonged there, was Toby, the man from the diner. Our eyes met. His gaze was cold, unreadable. Without a word, he turned, got into his car, and slowly backed out onto the snow-covered road, disappearing into the night. I was too stunned to react. Who was he? How had he gotten into my room? Why had he been there? The front desk worker's associate arrived shortly after. He was a large man who didn't speak English, and I had no idea what the two men were discussing. Eventually, the clerk offered me a different room, free of charge. I didn't feel safe, but I had no other options. The two men helped me move my belongings, and I spent a sleepless night in the new room, waiting for dawn. Todd offered to come and get me, but I refused. The roads were still dangerous in the dark and snow. I couldn't risk him getting into an accident. The next morning, the streets were partially cleared, enough for me to continue my drive. I reached Todd's place safely, but the sense of dread lingered. Looking back, I can't shake the feeling that the motel worker deliberately avoided calling the police. Perhaps he didn't want any trouble linked to his establishment. I called the diner later to warn them about Toby, though I doubt it would make much of a difference. This experience has changed me. I no longer trust strangers, not after what happened that night.